Is this not the best evening, the best way to spend an evening in November? Seriously, it's just wonderful. So we talked before about And Then There Were None, and now we are kind of discussing the way that Christie influences modern writers. And actually, Mark, I want to start with you, because I want to check with you. This is a story that I want to check with Mark about, the hotel story, because I've told this so many times, and I don't know if it's true, and it just says so much about Agatha, that they said, right, Agatha, you've now sold 100 million books. We're going to have you up to have a celebration dinner at the Savoy from Devon. So she comes up in Devon in her sort of slightly dirty Mac, and she gets to the door of the Savoy, and she says, I think there's a dinner here. And the security guard says to her, I'm sorry, madam, it's a VIP dinner, so we can't allow you in. And she then turns around and goes back to Devon. Is that true?
It's a version of that is true, yes. It's the Savoy, it's the mousetrap it was, actually. And, of course, she was then told off after, because they said, you were specifically asked to come early to make sure that you could come and, get everything ready before everyone else arrived. And she turns up, and they go, oh, no, it's only special people. And she sat there quietly, didn't quite go back to Devon, but sat there waiting for someone to come out later.
Do you think, I guess in a way, no disrespect to anyone else, but Mark probably knows more about Agatha than anyone in the building. Do you think
John Curran's not in the building, so we can go for that, yeah.
I often wonder, and she had an intimation of her greatness before she died, for sure. She died when I was 11, 1976. Do you think she'd be amazed that here we all are in 2024 talking about her?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's actually, even in correspondence, the idea that she sort of sees her stuff as not quite disposable, but of its time. And if you actually read some of her books, it's surprising how often you read them and she gives away the endings of earlier books. And I think that's quite indicative of someone who thinks, you'll read them, and that's lovely, and you move on. And I think that says a lot about how she didn't necessarily expect people to read them much, I guess, after her death and sort of in later on, but thinking, this is this year's book, you'll read it or you won't read it, and then you might read next year's or not.
Well, that's a bit like Dickens, I suppose, Lucy, where he's writing for a periodical, isn't he? He doesn't think he's going to be read in 100 years.
No, absolutely, that's true. Am I going to be quizzed on Dickens?
No, not at all.
So, I've got briefed on Christie.
Do you think, is this accidental greatness that we're seeing here, or what? What is it that makes her so brilliant?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, I think you put it so well when we first did an event together years ago, and you said there is just a sort of intangible magic about her. I mean, obviously she's a brilliant plotter. Obviously, in a book like And Then There Were None, you were talking about before, there's no fat on it. No one else could write that book. It's just so beautifully constructed. But then there is also this magic, so that even can we say, brilliant but slightly less brilliant Christies are still wonderful and still have that magic to them, and you'd still sort of prefer to read them than like any other murder mystery writer.
Well, because we're all obsessive, we were having this great conversation, Sophie, about the other ones we love. So 1, 2, buckle my shoe. I said, what's yours?
Oh, I've got loads that I love that I feel not enough people know about or love enough. So the one that immediately springs to mind is 3-Act Tragedy, which is a Poirot novel. Nobody will tell you that it's their favourite Agatha Christie. And I ask everyone what their favourite Agatha Christie is. And I sometimes have to stop myself from going, well, they'll say whatever they say, and then I have to stop myself from going, but what about 3-Act Tragedy? It's so brilliant, it's so clever. There's 3 murders in it, and 2 out of the 3 are just so brilliantly high concept in a way that only Christie could do. And it's just incredibly readable. But there's so many that you could put in that category, right? There's Appointment with Death, and was it you that was saying 450 from Paddington?
Oh, such a great book.
Which I think I've heard some people say, well, it doesn't quite work on the cluing front, but it's just so readable.
What about ABC Murders? I mean,
totally.
Is that because I read a book recently which is all about the forensics of Agatha Christie by someone called Carla Valentine, and she's a forensic pathologist, and she said that around the world there have been various serial killers who've used the same technique in the ABC murders. Is that right?
We're not going to blame Agatha Christie for that.
Well-
I think that's an independent choice that people are making.
Yes, sure.
We could flip it on its head, though, and say
Yes.
that people have solved crimes thanks to the Pale Horse, which we were sort of talking
Yeah.
about, because you were incredulous that I put the Pale Horse so low on my 1960s rankings.
Yes.
The Pale Horse has such a good sort of description of the poisoning that it was used more than once, actually, in people discovering it. Can I cheat and go back to a question you asked?
Yes, please, yeah.
Because I remember you introducing the audiobook of After the Funeral
Yes.
and saying how that was a really underrated one.
I love that.
And you pointed out very cleverly about that the motive for it, which I'm not going to spoil, is so small scale but believable that the person wants a very particular thing, and that
Yes.
overrides everything.
And also, for those of you who've read After the Funeral will know, and if you haven't, you've got a treat in store. It is really a double-layered motive. So there's the motive behind the motive in the case of that book, which not all murder mysteries have. That's another hidden gem.
Obviously we'll probably have a couple of spoilers here, and as we go through the ones. Why didn't they ask Evans? Is incredible for the motivation. So the guy falls off a cliff. His last words are, "Why didn't they ask Evans?" And the reason he asks that is just brilliant, Lucy.
So clever. I think I was just thinking that, I think that's the thing. She did everything first and best as well. I think that's the other thing. I was thinking of the ways in which she broke the rules, and they still feel audacious now. Sorry, that wasn't really the answer to your question.
No,
but was just
and in a
answering the
way,
first question.
with Evans, it taught me that if someone's called Betty, their name may also be Beth. It may also be Liz. It could be a whole load of other things as well. And people, I think different identities is a big thing, where in let's just think about this. I think it is a murder is an
A murder is an
outswear.
outswear.
Okay, we probably better not say what's going on.
Just to go say something about why didn't they ask Evans. So this is, I think, another thing about Christie. She's just an incredibly clever and subtle thinker. So everyone who's in the book world or in the book industry knows that if a book has a great hook, then it's going to be of more interest to readers, it's going to sell better. And what people normally mean by a good hook is the sort of hook like And Then There Were None has, like everyone's on an island, everyone's dead, there's no one left to be the murderer. That's like a sort of conventional great hook. Why didn't they ask Evans? Has a very, very subtle but irresistible hook, and that is that this chap who falls off a cliff, his dying words, which he says to a passerby who then becomes our narrator, he looks up and says to this narrator, "Why didn't they ask Evans?" And then he dies. And that's the hook. Now, it's an amazing, irresistible hook, and yet it isn't, it's kind of oddly quirky. Like, imagine if you were pitching to a publisher now in the contemporary era, and the brilliant hook is that he says, "Why didn't they ask Evans?" Like, I can imagine my editor going, is that a great hook? But it is a great hook, and Agatha was clever enough in a subtle way to realise. And I remember when I first read that book, when I first heard about it and bought it, thinking, my life will not be possible henceforth if I don't know why they didn't ask Evans. I have to drop everything and find this out right now. And she knew that people en masse would feel that way.
So funny enough, with my editor hat on, I think the hook still works. I think you wouldn't be allowed the title these days. They just say, you'd have to have a one word, something.
Evans. or why?
Let me just have a show of hands. Does anyone know why they didn't ask Evans? So a third of the room. So we won't spoil it, but there's a very good reason, isn't there, why they didn't ask Evans. It's a brilliant reason.
Well, I think also the really terrifying thing from a modern perspective, and I'm sat here with three, I don't write fiction, you guys all write fiction. She was writing 3 books a year at that point, and she was going, here's another great content. And then at the end of the 30s, I've done Orient Express, done Death and Noir, I guess I'll bash out, and then there were none, just to round off the decade. It's just incredible that, not always 3 books a year, but at least 2 a year during the 1930s.
It's like when you learn Dolly Parton wrote 2 of her hit songs in the same day.
I will always love you, and absolutely. And
What is it? Elton John's diary says, "Bought a Rolls Royce and wrote Candle in the Wind." That was in the morning, So one of the book I mentioned, which does the forensic pathology, is looking at the way that Christie used forensics. And this is fascinating, and it did help her, actually. She was born at the right time, because with her, she had a few contacts in the police, she'd been a nurse, and she was aware, firstly, of poisons, secondly, of the detection of poisons, and thirdly, they were making some strides on fingerprints. And while she was writing in the 1920s, the early books, they even worked out that they could tell the difference between animal blood and human blood, right?
Yeah.
And that was all stuff that went straight in, didn't it?
Yeah, she's a contemporary writer. She's always writing about what's happening in the world, including those sorts of...
I think that's the thing. I think if she were writing today, you know, we all have this sort of nostalgic image of her, and this, you know, I do sometimes think, oh, it would be great if DNA hadn't been discovered, and, you know, phones, just generally phones, what do I do about those, and have to find all sorts of ways of getting rid of cell phone service and things. But I think she would be right there at the forefront. She'd be kind of looking into AI and how that could be used in a murder, and she would be... Yeah, top of her game still.
As three people who've really thought about Agatha, and I'm assuming, no, none of us have met her, that's for sure. Sophie, what kind of a woman was she? If you walked into a room and she was there, can you imagine what she was like as a person?
I mean, I'm absolutely sure she was a really lovely person. I mean, I've read her autobiography, and you can tell straight away that she's just lovely and kind and good and, yeah, an amazing, impressive person. I know, only because I've heard from various sources, that she was quite shy, so she preferred to listen to other people. She was very, very interested in other people. She didn't like to be the one holding forth and being the centre of attention. I think she was a very, very clever person. And I think whether she realised it or not, she was, in her approach to her work, she was kind of philosophical. I think she approached crime writing in a way where, I mean, maybe not initially, but eventually, I think she started to think, okay, there's this borderline, this boundary around the genre crime fiction. What else could it be stretched to contain while still being definitely crime? Like, what else is possible? And for us to still be able to truthfully say this is a crime novel, but it's something that we wouldn't have necessarily thought of before. So I think she thought about the genre in a very philosophical way.
Do you think, Lucy, when you read Miss Marple, you're reading Agatha's autobiographical character in some way?
No, I mean, well, I think that what I love, we were talking about the dark marple theory before. I think I have to get Mark to explain the dark marple theory. But I think, you know, yes, in the sense that you had this woman who's kind of superpower in a way as her sort of invisibility, you know, and she's there sort of quietly observing, and she has this intuition that she uses, an incredible intelligence, like a mind to rival Sherlock Holmes, you know, Marple, talking about also Christie, but people sort of underestimate her, and the whole kind of, you know, Christie being put in this kind of middle brow box, and oh, she just does this sort of, Raymond Carver said such horrible things about her, you know, she just does this sort of drawing room murder mystery, and of course she didn't. Look at Endless Night, look at And Then There Were None, look at, there's so much there to refute it. But I think in that sense, yes. But I think what's interesting is I think people also have this idea of her as this sort of Marple figure who spent her whole life in this sort of little village in England, and actually she was this incredibly globe-trotting, you know, she went surfing, she went skiing, she spent a lot of her time in the Middle East with her husband, who was an archaeologist. She had this incredible life, really.
What do you think she'd be like if you met her?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly she'd be shy, and she wouldn't come here, I'm sorry to say. We wouldn't have got her into this room, certainly not to give a speech. But I actually hear that in private company, when she knew people, she was obviously less shy, so you perhaps saw a different side to her. There are a few sort of home movie films of her in the Middle East on digs, and you can see her sort of smiling and chatting to people, and I always think that's a really good indication, because that's not one of those awful clips of the reporters grabbing her outside the mousetrap and saying, why do you think it's lasted for 5 years, or whatever I had at that point. But her actually in her comfort. So I think much more than that. The big thing about Miss Marple is Christie was only in her 30s when she wrote the first Miss Marple stories. So, not so much at that point. But as she got older, Miss Marple, and she got closer in age, suddenly a lot of Miss Marple's memories are the same as Agatha Christie's.
I went to a little dinner party in the street I live in, and the conversation lulled. There was about 10 people there. I didn't know all of them that well. And I thought I'd better say something, and I said, I really like true crime. I can't get enough of it. And the whole room, I thought someone would say, I love true crime as well. The other 9 people just went, you animal. Like they were just like, I'd chosen the wrong crowd, And I think, I don't know, I mean, this true crime thing now is massive. And we, what have I just watched? The Ted Bundy stuff and the blooming clown killer in the States and this and that. And it's just endless. And I don't know if that changes the way we see Agatha. In that it seems more cartoon-like now.
I don't know, but you look at Murder on the Orient Express, and that was directly inspired by true crime at the time, wasn't it? It was the... Mark, I'm going to hand over
Go on.
to you.
Well, the Lindbergh.
Baby, yeah.
Well, that was I see. Yeah, that was a kidnapping. Yeah. Okay. All right.
That's kind of really contemporaneous.
Yes,
wasn't
you're
it?
right. And it's referred to in the book, isn't it? Yeah.
It's very simple.
Yeah. Oh, I see. So she would have been into her crew. She wouldn't have been the one saying,
She had,
"You
I was
sick
just
animal."
at the Agatha Christie archive this week, and I was going through some
Casual.
stuff.
Lucky old you.
And I, at the back of a typescript, and I'll save this for book 3, but there was a collection of press cuttings about crimes that she had annotated.
Oh, really?
So she was really paying attention.
And I know that there were certain crimes of the day, and I don't know if the acid bath murderer was one, for example, but they actually get referred to.
Oh, loads ago. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Haig and
The brides in the bar, is that
yes,
the bride?
yes,
Brides in the bath.
yes, lots.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of them were bigger at the time than they are now. Sophie.
But to answer your question about do her
Excuse
books
me.
look cartoon-like compared to true crime, I don't think they do at all, because I think one of the brilliant sort of elements of her genius is that there is, yes, she's writing fiction, but there is so much truth about the human mind and the human condition in her books. And I think there's different ways things can be true. So when I read, I haven't actually imbibed much true crime since the brilliant series Serial.
Oh, yeah.
Does anyone remember
Well, that was the
Serial
first
with
thing, yeah.
Adnan and Jay? That was so brilliant. Everything I listened to or read that was
Really?
true
So you
crime
haven't done the staircase? You haven't done Making a Murderer?
I did do the staircase.
Because the staircase is classic. That's classic Christie, actually.
I did those
Yeah.
as well, but nothing has ever lived up to Serial for me. But when I read, say, Death on the Nile, or, the ones which, Endless Night, The Pale Horse, there is so much truth in there about the way things can go wrong and just about everything that I feel as though they're really describing reality via fiction rather than just like making up stories, although obviously there are brilliant made up stories as well. But I don't think I still will always prefer really brilliant mystery fiction to true crime, I think.
What about you, Lucy, as a writer who's, David was describing your many millions that you sold. Do you go back to Christie a lot, or do you think, no, that great as it is, it's very much back in the day?
Oh my goodness, no, all the time. It is very annoying, as I say, that she kind of did everything first and best. But I go back to Christie. So I have my sort of unholy, I guess, trinity of sort of female crime writers that I go to for inspiration. I go to Agatha Christie for plot, for everything, but for plot, I go to Patricia Highsmith for character, and I go to Daphne du Maurier for atmosphere.
Wow.
And so if I'm ever in, ever kind of stymied, I think, what would they do?
But it's interesting you mentioned the 3 women there, and whether actually, well, back then particularly, women did crime better. And there's why is that? Explain your theory there.
Oh my goodness, that's a whole kind of thesis.
Yeah, but it suddenly struck because Nio Marsh was another one who from New Zealand, and she similarly, Dorothy L. Sayers. That it was dominated by women actually.
Well, I don't want to generalise, because I think everyone can
Conan
write.
Doyle, I accept as an exception. Yeah.
Well, I think everyone can write kind of, all genders can write brilliantly sort of psychologically intricate, novels. But I was chatting to Lisa Jewell, and she was saying that she wrote her women's fiction, as it's called, first. She wrote these sort of family sagas and things. And she says that she thinks that sort of allowed her to bring this sort of richness of character, I suppose, into her brilliant crime, what do you call them, crime novels, thrillers now, that I think just really kind of enriches them for me. And she's so compassionate towards her characters, even the bad ones. And I think, that is something that I see in Christie, that I see in Du Maurier, that I see in Highsmith. She can really make us root for the sociopath. She takes us to such uncomfortable places with the Ripleyage. Why do we want him to get away with it? It's awful. But I think it is that kind of richness of characterization. But I don't think that's just something that women can do. But maybe men in that era were interested in writing a particular sort of crime book, or felt they should be writing.
Maybe it was Ian Fleming, that was the male genre.
Flemings, the Carvers,
Yeah.
They felt it had to be this quite sort of magic. I don't know, I'm just sort of thinking on my feet because I haven't really thought about it, but it's a great question.
Is it so? All right, looking at the things that Christie did first, the classic is the drawing room denouement, isn't it? That was all Christie, correct?
Yeah, well, it was the thing about, you can always, if you want to really dig through things that people have read for a long time, someone's always done it first, but certainly popularised this thing. And she wrote Mysterious Affair at Styles to end in a courtroom, and was told, it doesn't work. This isn't, you couldn't have Poirot stand up as a witness and say, I'm going to reveal it all to the court, and say that's not going to pass. So that's why it ends up being in the sort of drawing room. She does it less than you think. She does do it quite a lot, don't get me wrong. But often she can find clever ways to sort of reveal it.
You mentioned Mysterious Affair of Styles, and we had a reference earlier. It's very hard to talk about that book without a spoiler, and I block your ears up if you haven't read it. But there we have I don't know if that's the classic first unreliable narrator. Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So sorry. So yeah, thank you. That's the unreliable narrator, Sophie. Yeah, and that's. I remember as a teenager reading that, thinking, "Oh my God, the whole thing is 3 dots. It's an ellipsis.
Yeah.
That's the giveaway." Yeah. So no one had done that before, I don't think.
Well, there's a brilliant podcast called All About Agatha. I'm sure if you're at this event, you know about this podcast. If you don't know about it, you'll be thrilled to have heard about it, because basically they go through every single one of Agatha's books, discuss it in great depth, give it marks out of 10 according to a whole load of different criteria. I go on occasionally as a guest and quibble about the criteria, because I would add some different criteria, but it's brilliant. It's just like Agatha Geek's paradise. Anyway, there was a relatively recent episode where Kemper Donovan, the host, invited on a guest, and it would be brilliant if I could remember his name, but I can't, but I can find it. And anyway, this brilliant guest, who was a playwright and a filmmaker, American, he said, actually, a lot of the very clever things that people associate with Agatha, she didn't do first, but it doesn't matter because it's brilliant, and da-da-da-da. And Kemper, the host, agreed that it was brilliant. And I was like, wait, what? I'd actually like to know this. Yeah. Not that it makes her books any less brilliant, but to me, if, for example, let's say I found out that, Roger Ackroyd was something that had been done before that device, and say Murder on the Orient Express wasn't, then in my personal rankings, I would bump up Murder on the Orient Express a lot, because if you do something incredibly ingenious for the first time ever, I do think that counts. I think you get extra ingenious points.
What if you don't know about the previous one?
Then you still get the ingenious points.
Yeah, see, I think that there are a few times that she deliberately took it, but there's only so many stories, and so you can always dig out and find an older one.
Surely Murder on the Orient Express, that structure of solution hadn't been done before.
I don't know of one, but that's like a challenge.
I've been meaning to ask Kemper about it ever since.
We mentioned earlier, and then there were none, and the fact that she had seen a play which used that device of everyone dies, including the presumed killer, because they must be among the dead. So it was called the nine at the table or something like that. But as you say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
People aren't reading or watching those.
No.
Because they don't do it as well as Agatha Christie did. The point is to take that idea and make it really good.
But the other thing I think that she really has is the sleuth. And it's not, the police men, no police women, I don't think, but the police men are all side characters in her books, really, Inspector Japp and all that. it's actually all about the amateur sleuth. And that's the lovely thing, Lucy, and that feels very Agatha.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I love how she sends them up, these sort of bumbling police detective figures. She has such fun with them, I think.
I'm amazed they let Poirot anywhere near the murder scene. Hastings, and I suppose Sherlock Holmes was the original amateur sleuth. Yeah.
But then it's one of those things where if you read it in a book, you might think, oh, well, I'll suspend disbelief, this would never happen. But actually, in real life, as I'm sure we all know, things happen that should never happen.
Yeah.
I can remember I used to live in a very dangerous part of Manchester, and I was regularly mugged, held up at gunpoint, burgled. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Those things happened. And I remember after one of the times I was mugged, I went to the police station, and a police detective was showing me a kind of like photo album full of mug shots and going, do you recognise anyone? And the person who'd mugged me was not among these photographs. So I was going, and I remembered him, quite well. I was going, no. And we got to the end of the album, still had it. And then the policeman leans over and goes, could it have been him?
No.
Him. I went, no. He went, come on, him.
Wow.
Think about it. Could it? I was like, no. And then I said, this was hilarious. I said, that person is clearly just a brunette. The person who mugged me was kind of a brunette, but he definitely had ancestors with ginger hair.
Wow.
And I was really going off on one. I was like, so when people have basically got brown hair, but there is a redhead somewhere. And the police was like, yeah, shut up. Is it him? Say it's him. And I went home and I said to my husband, like, he was really telling me to say, and I don't know what he had against this one mugshot as opposed to all the others. But I was like, that shouldn't happen. But it did.
I thought you were going to say you saw someone you knew.
I was exactly. But what's so weird is, okay, Agatha, let's say, gave us the citizen sleuth, if we can call Poirot that. And then we go a long way away from that, and it's all police officers, and it's the Sweeney and whatnot. Now, that terrible story of that woman, Nicola Bulley, who fell in a river, and it was just a very sad story, and the whole world decides to solve it. And they do it because they can go via Google, and they can look from space, and, there's a couple who are living in a house nearby, and there's someone standing in their living room with a clipboard who says, I want to ask you some questions about the recent death in the river. And this is just this has gone crazy now. This is Agatha's World now. Everyone is trying to solve everything.
It's not Agatha's World. That's other people's problems. That's their fault. We're not blaming Agatha for
It's
that.
nuts. Everyone's a sleuth now. Though.
Everyone is a sleuth. But I mean, when I'm reading Agatha's book, I'm a sleuth within the confines that she set out, which is, I know I'm going to have a satisfactory ending on page 220 or whatever, which is a bit different to going to someone's living room with a clipboard.
I said earlier, I read all 66 when I was a teenager. I only solved one. Is that...
Which one?
Well, that's a good question. It was Curtin, actually. It was Curtin, Poirot's last case, yeah.
Where you guessed the ending.
Yes, exactly. And it was, even if I'd been, if we'd asked a kind of an animal in a zoo to try and guess, they would have got a better strike rate than me. So, how am I so bad? Is it just me or what? Or is she deliberately,
no,
she's sending me off the whole time?
Well, firstly, so one of the things I think she does brilliantly is she understands that the top priority for a writer should be pleasure for her readers. That's one of the many reasons why she's so popular. She wants us to have as great a time as possible while reading her books. And she knows that what that means for us is we don't guess. If we guessed, we wouldn't have as brilliant a time. We need that moment where Poirot or Marple or some handsome young man who happens to stroll into a village and find murders there tells us the clever thing and we go, oh, and then we get that amazingly satisfying kind of parallax view feeling of like, oh yeah, and there was that, but I didn't see it in that way, and now it all makes sense. And that's so satisfying. But we don't want to have guessed. In fact, one of the Christie novels that I don't rank highly, even though it's almost perfection in every other way, is Murder is Easy, because I really saw that solution coming.
Oh, did you?
Assumed I must be wrong, wasn't wrong, and I was like, what is going on? Because that's the only one I've...
Well, because the obvious suspect then did it, yeah, but then that's also clever,
Well, I was just going to say, what I do really appreciate, though, about Christie is that she also plays fair. So I think she would prefer you guess in the first chapter then she pulls the rug out from under you
Yeah.
and you feel tricked, because that's a sort of cheap feeling if you feel
Yeah.
tricked. Whereas I think,
Yeah,
you
you
know, you
never
have that
feel tricked.
wonderful kind of, you're surprised, but it's that, of course. You
Yeah.
know, so actually, mirror cracked from side to side. I think this
Just
is in
what
your
I was
book.
thinking
learned
about,
this.
yes.
I learnt this
Well,
reading
that's
this book,
brilliant,
but-
that one. We haven't mentioned
which
that yet today.
Which is brilliant, but her publishers were worried because they said that people would guess too easily, and she refused to take out certain clues, didn't she?
Yeah,
Because
so she took out some but kept a lot. And even then, with the ones that she took out, she
But
felt guilty.
this was a huge revelation to me. So I was listening to your podcast, the episode, what was that episode called where you were ranking all the ones from the 60s?
Oh, that was with Kemper on All About Agatha.
Yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
it was brilliant. It was the Swinging Christie's podcast and the All About Agatha podcast coming together. So it was like geek heaven. And I didn't realise that had happened with Mirror Crack, that she'd been told it might be too obvious and so she'd taken stuff out. Because one of the puzzles I always had with reading that book is that it is one of the cleverest and most impressive puzzle and solution combinations. Without a doubt, it's just a brilliant thing.
Help me here, because I'm trying to. I don't want to spoil it, but she's shocked, and it's.
Well, we
It's
probably,
details
we probably
of,
don't want to.
something.
No, we
Yeah,
shouldn't.
I don't
Okay, we
want
should,
to.
because
It's the
I'm
specific
thinking of you.
details.
It's the one with the film star.
Yeah.
And does she die or does someone else die?
Someone else dies.
Someone else dies.
Okay,
And there's a big mystery around, like, she's looking and what's she looking at.
Yeah.
The mystery is brilliantly constructed. And when you find out the solution, it is undoubtedly one of the
It's
best
brilliant. I remember it,
motives
yeah.
and everything. But I always had a frustration with that book, and I've read it about 5 times, and the frustration doesn't go away, which is I don't get that I call it feeling the solve. That moment where you go, brilliant.
goosebumps.
I don't get that with Mirror Crack. And I get to the point every time where I'm like, okay, I know what the solution is, but where was the kind of da-da moment where I got to be impressed by the solution? That's missing. And I think it's because of that thing that you've said.
And it's funny that the
because
clue...
it couldn't be seeded in case it was too obvious. So we then didn't get to go, oh yeah, there was that and there was that.
The clue is a motive clue, it's a character clue.
Yeah.
It's not about, oh, and I spotted a dagger in the cupboard.
Yeah.
It's about something that's happened in
It's
someone's
very
past.
Marple, because-
You
Yeah,
go,
but
oh, I
that's-
see why that might lead someone to murder.
Yeah.
I love
but that
how
doesn't
we're
matter.
going very deep here. I sort of want. What did she take out? Can you tell me?
Yeah, it was the details of something that happened in the past. So she made
Yeah,
it more
exact-
general,
specifically.
basically. Well, I'll spoil it if you want to cover
Oh,
your
well,
ears.
do.
So it's the mention of German measles.
Okay, all right. The mention of German measles. All right, no, you haven't spoiled it. That's fine. It's good.
But yeah,
There are
no, but I-
66
It's still
to
in the
read.
book. It's still in the
Don't
book,
worry,
but
it's
it's
still
much
worth.
later in the
Still
book.
worth reading. Yeah.
But I think
It's still in the
it's
book.
fine if it's a character clue, but for me, I'm obsessed with this concept of feeling the solve. Often, if you read a crime novel and you get to the end and you kind of go, that kind of wasn't good, and I'm not sure why. It's not that the solution isn't there; it's that you don't get that feeling of like, aha, now
Right.
I get it. And I think Mirror Crack just lacks that slightly.
Okay. We talked earlier about plot holes and whether it matters if there's a socking great plot hole in a book. It may not matter, Lucy. What do you think?
Oh, I think it does matter. I do. Yeah. And I think, but I don't think Christie has a lot. Or I don't think they're important ones. I think actually, personally, I think if something's tied up too neatly at the end, it can feel a bit synthetic. But you need the right stuff to be in the right place. I'm not such a Christie expert that you'll probably tell me there are all sorts of kind of big
I can only
holes
think
there, but I
Well,
think
Murder
there's
in
your one
Mesopotamia
from-
is
what
the
about
only
South
one.
Cyprus? You spotted a plot hole in
Yes, about someone's choice of drink that you have to assume that somebody was
I can't
going
remember.
to
You told me what, and you
pick.
said.
Yes,
and it
I'm
could
not going to
easily-
spoil any more for people.
No,
But
we're
you
not, but
said
don't worry.
it could have easily been fixed. They just needed to do that. And I was
Yeah,
like, oh,
yeah, where someone clarifies
So
why
that
they
has
might have
bugged
one
me
drink.
ever since then.
Sorry.
Do you know? Isn't it amazing? We could go. We've mentioned maybe 15 titles. We could have done another 45 or 50, isn't that? We could have done the 51 titles still. So if you haven't read, who hasn't read a single Agatha? No shame involved. Okay, are you looking forward to reading one, sir? Yeah, I mean, and I would say don't start with "And Then There Were None" because it's almost, if it's number one, you want to start with something.
Yeah,
Go on, give us
After
your,
the funeral.
for someone who hasn't read a single one. Let's recommend one to this gentleman here. Lucy, you go first.
I'm going to say A Murder is Announced because I just think it's so clever. It's probably up there with some of her best. It's perhaps not my favourite, but I just think it gives you everything. She really plays fair. There's the kind of misdirection in there. It's got this wonderful kind of post-war sort of so much going on there, you know, kind of post-war.
We talked about it earlier, the advert
community.
saying, yeah.
You've got this wonderful kind of drawing room scene, as it were.
Yeah.
So you've got your kind of like peak Christie, I guess, you know, in
Okay.
terms of the TV stuff.
So murder is announced. Note this down, sir. Sophie.
I'm going to give two, a Poirot and a Marple.
Go
And if we had more time, I could give an hour lecture about why these are the right two to start with. For Marple, The Body in the Library, that is a that is a flawless detective novel. And for Poirot, Evil Under the Sun, which is also pretty flawless.
Which we haven't mentioned yet. Go on,
it's
Mark.
top five for sure.
I often go with The Murder is Announced, so I double that. If you want a Poirot, then Peril at End House is a really good opener.
Love that one too. And I would say, when we had 2020, I saw in the papers it's 100 years since her first one. I think she failed to get it with 16 publishers or so. So it's incredible. And it just, although it doesn't make a lot of sense all the way through, you can see the use of poison is there. There's a guy with a massive beard, which is immediate red flag. It's the mysterious affair at Styles. And the other thing she developed, first time, map of the house on page 1. And you keep going back to it. So you've got so much excitement ahead, sir. Listen, I can't thank you enough. And I hope David's going to come back on and thank Harper as well. Is David there? Or maybe we just draw it to a close. What should we do? Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sophie and Lucy and Mark.
And thank you, Jeremy.
And thanks to all of you as well. I hope you had a good night. Thank you.